So the biggest sun right now, or star, is also known as STEPHENSON2-18. And there's probably even bigger stars out there. But at the same time, though, we have yet to find them. So we're going to talk about one of the biggest known stars that ever existed in the universe. Okay, so the star is so far away and so big that even to this day, the scientists that discovered it and as well as examined it still don't know if it's a red hypergiant or if it's just a red giant star. And basically, they have either way, it's huge, but it's the luminosity and the mass and the luminous material of it actually determines if you know, whatever category it falls into. And there's a certain scale it has to meet before it either hits it's a giant or a super hyper red giant, and or something like that. So it's either a red giant or a red hypergiant star, and it's really interesting to think like how many classifications they can come up with this, like how many subgroupings there can be for illuminations and mass and man, it's just amazing to think like how big of a star this can be. But they say like right now it's like roughly like it could just the outside shell of the star can actually consume the orbit of Saturn, maybe a little bit less depending on how long it is, but it's like 2,150 radius of the sun. And it's actually classified, despite it being very luminous and extremely huge and red, it's actually spectacle design is actually, you know, it's labeled as an M6 in a different classification as a, you know, kind of star that it falls into, the properties that it detains and all that, which is very unusual because despite the physical characteristics that it already has, it's already very rare and very, like, compared to a lot of other stuff that we found, but then yet you find something like this, and this just goes to show you that all stars can maintain different, you change one thing in the cycle of its lifespan and it has different results. Now it lives a long time and every star in comparison could be different in their own way, and that just goes to show you that a star this big has many different mysteries to offer to the world of science. So basically, somewhere on the planet or the star, it's like 3,200 Kelvin, which is like 5,300.33 degrees Fahrenheit. But I'm sure it gets a lot hotter the further you go into its core. So this is like probably starting from like the outside, from what I understand. Yeah, it's a pretty big star. It glows red. But I do think maybe it's even possible that our sun might actually be hotter due to it being white instead of red. But at the same time, though, maybe that might not necessarily always be true, though, because stars that illuminate, because it's really interesting. It illuminates a lot of light, so maybe like we're looking at the wrong colors. It could very well be a very hot star, even in comparison. But I guess it really depends on the physical properties of it. And you'd have to do a lot of sorting through the ultraviolet radiation that it does produce. So like if you watch my other video, I kind of explained how like they did the same thing with the sun, where like if you were to stare at the sun, sort of, it kind of you can sort of see, it kind of looks like it's white, but it really kind of looks like more of like an orange color, especially like at night. And that's because it's like the color filtering that you're seeing. So really you would have to set a probe to the sun, get really close to it, take a picture of it, and then you'd see like without the ultraviolet light distorting it. But I mean, good luck doing it with this star because it's 6 million. You're basically talking like it's almost 6 million parsecs away from this planet, basically 3.27 or 17 or whatever it was. I think it was 3.27 parsecs. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I used to remember it all the time. It's somewhere around there. So it's roughly, you're talking like it's roughly almost 19,000 light years from this planet. But it is in the solar system, or not solar system, it's in this galaxy though. So that's how far, just one of the many stars that we have yet to find though. But I do believe there might even be other planets orbiting it right now, because depending on how big a star is might actually also impact how fast it moves, because even black holes move too, just to kind of give a little reference. And what's really strange is, like, I mean, as strange as it really does sound, there are stars out there that despite how they might move and how big they might be, the larger their orbit is, the larger their, or large as the mass is, like how big the object itself is, also can affect how big its circular, it's gravity and how far out it can reach. Like, for example, like our solar system, for example, you see how far it can reach out. It's like 122 astronomical units or something like that, the distance between here and the sun, which is 93 million miles. So if the circumference of the star is anything to really guess at, and it really is like right around the orbit of Saturn, then it would take approximately 9 hours for the speed of light to make one round trip around the circumference of it. And apparently, according to the solar mass of our sun, apparently STEPHENSON2-18 actually has a mass of 10 billion times the solar masses of the sun. So you could basically take the mass of our sun and put 10 billion suns into that star. And that's how big it is, as far as how heavy and the material that it weighs on, that implements from its core all the way to its outer shell. So as of right now, the star is like maybe roughly 20 million years old, but it very well could be growing still to the point where it actually turns into what is known as a yellow hypergiant. It's not just a red yellow hypergiant, but it's basically a star. Basically, from what I understand, depending on how fast, because a bigger star uses a lot more energy. But like they say, basically the way the star works is like the younger it is and the bigger it is, like it might actually have a shorter lifespan then, because of how much energy it's burning through and its temperatures rise drastically. So if that brings it to the end of its cycle very fast, it very well will turn into, it's basically like a plutonium bomb, basically. Think of it like that, because it got the firepower and the energy there. So one big form of stored energy, and you create a supernova, and that energy, despite what it might wipe out, or it might collapse into a black hole if it does. Basically what it does is, because it really depends on the mass and the density, but once a star is decided, if either it's going to blow up, like explode, or it's going to implode a black hole. That's what black holes do, by the way. Basically, it'll either send the energy to another dimension, which is what black holes speculate to do now. We think that that might actually be a gateway to another universe. And it makes sense, sort of, too, because, if the energy is if there's so much energy there, especially in its wide surrounding, it would just send it to another dimension and thus create like a different, and therefore it could create like a new universe, in the sense that it opens up to more dimensions. Like the radiation is all there, the energy obviously is still there too, and it's all concentrated, and it could be superheated, and therefore, it just sends it to another realm, which is actually very cool, actually. Well, either way, and then even if that's misunderstood of it, a supernova blows up, and the energy stays in the universe that it's in, and what ends up happening is that universe then ends up expanding its sources. So, like, again, going back to the law of conservation and the first and second law of thermodynamics, it basically would state that the energy can multiply, and therefore it would continue to grow. So that solar system, so like one star might end, but because of how big it is and how much concentrated energy it has, and therefore it's turned it into its physical properties, it will turn back to a nebula, and over time you'll create more stars with that same energy and just keep multiplying it. So in a way, it's almost like the stars are just multiplying over and over and over again each. So when people say like, the universe is finding it at its end and everything is finding its way at its end, it's not really, because you're still, the energy is still there and it's still multiplying. And even if you take the energy and move it somewhere else, you still have like another universe or another form of cloning or another way of life. One life ends, another begins. So the term infinity, never ending and endless, just carries out its mission. And just like a lot of other stars that are based on their size, their mass, and luminosity, they all have what is known as stellar winds. And this has a lot to do with like how like some of the light gets pushed around. You can also see like some of the flame bursts that they have, like the solar flares, for example. This might also explain why like certain stars are able to do what they do as far as like how they travel, and not just through space, but like how like the nuclear fusions and fissions actually can affect their atmosphere, as well as like the outside core of the star, or like the most outside layer, the shell of the star, basically. And the stellar winds, believe it or not, like it's like the bigger a star gets, it can actually ruin its atmosphere. Kind of like how like solar winds can ruin like certain planetary atmospheres, like Mars and Venus, for example. And Venus might be a bad example of it because it's got like a new atmosphere, because it's condensed itself with sulfuric acid. But like Mars, for example, would be a good example. Solar winds destroyed its atmosphere over time, and so it's like the same thing could be said about, you know, STEPHENSON2-18 or 2-18. Its atmosphere could have been ruined based on the size it gained, but at the same time based on how the stellar winds were pushing around the material, like the plasma. So it's very interesting because what's really strange is, you know, for a star such as Stephenson to begin with, like its luminosity levels, even for being an M6 star, is actually very, very rare indeed, because it actually has, it just goes to show you that all stars are different and they all accelerate at something completely different, to the point where like even the sun, for example, has surpassed certain things as far as like the stars that, like if you compare it to on average, like the characteristics are all different. Like they can either range from very low, higher than average, or lower than average, you know, like temperature, mass, speed, the speed the star orbits and travels, the life cycle of it. Like it really just depends, but it just goes to show you that everything is different. Kind of like how like when a human or a new organism is born, like it's got different genetics, different traits, offspring, for example. And you know, as far as evolution goes, and you know, same thing like with stars, for example, you know, they have their own cycle, and it seems like every time it's giving birth to like a new cycle, like, you know, you don't know where it's going to end up. You know, what kind of star is it going to become? Where is it going to fit into the star cycle? Stephenson2-18, some of the things we've noticed about it was not only one of the biggest stars ever discovered, but it also seems to have gotten lucky with, like, you know, how luminous and how much mass it picked up even early on in its life. You know, like it picked up a lot. It accelerated at some stuff, like just higher than average than certain things. So what this has to do with the star's characteristics is how it behaves. You know, some things move faster than it should. And it's definitely shown that, you know, if there are a bunch of scientists that can somehow get closer to it and we can examine its actual surface, you know, because of how bright it is, of course, we would be able to learn like new things about how stars behave, you know, whether like how fast they can do nuclear fusions or fissions, and maybe even how fast they can traverse the light, you know, not just, you know, the speed of light, but because I've always wondered, you know, does every star, like the speed of light is roughly 300,000 kilometers per second. And while that is true, is it true that every photon travels at the same velocity? Every star, every light particle, every, you know, do all stars have the same speed of light, basically? I mean, I think so, but it's like, I've always wondered if that was ever different at one point. You know, that's just what we estimated at. And it could be even faster than that. Not to mention, you know, even if like, and here's something else to think about that's even more complex, you know, kind of getting off topic, but if we're talking acceleration, you know, things in the universe, it can actually, this is just proof that it has to be like an acceleration of some kind, or rather a estimation acceleration, because it just seems like we are, like, when you really look at how things are affected through the universe, everything's affected at a different velocity. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, say dark flow really does exist, like in the sense that we look at it, it's a hypothetical sense. But if it's able to concentrate itself to the point where like the universe can expand itself and it gets even faster and it never slows down, then it's doing two things. It's also, like, at the same time, it's multiplying itself the faster it goes, and it's accelerating even faster. So the faster it goes, the more energy it burns. The more energy it burns, the faster it can travel through the universe. But it can also keep cloning itself to the point where it never runs out. I'll give you an example. If anybody remembers Rick and Morty, again, the concentrated dark matter episode, the simulation episode. You know, that was basically what those aliens were after, because they found a way to, like, they could recycle energy, but at the same time, though, they could use finite resources to get, like, turning something finite into infinity, and they would never run out of it. Hence the unlimited travel and faster distance upgrades, that they could travel through the solar systems and the galaxies and even end up somewhere else in a shorter period of time. And that's kind of like how I feel like star systems would be. The ideal procedure through time travel and space travel comes down to the material and energy you're using. But if you can figure out how to also finite your resources and turn them into infinity, now you got yourself even more upgrades that are actually imaginable. And so it's interesting to think, like, stars can sort of do the same thing with, like, their life cycles, as well as expanding of the universe. You know, they all travel at different velocities, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're always traveling at the same speed. It could just pick up, it might even slow down at some point, but it's still going faster the further out it goes, and it's cloning more energy so it never runs out, which is even more ridiculous. So that's actually really interesting to think about. It's also kind of weird if you think about it as far as STEPHENSON2-18 and STEPHENSON2, which is another star basically in its cluster. They state that despite them being the biggest stars that they have, in some cases they've lost even more mass than most of the stars in their cluster too, which is kind of weird because it's, you know, like a star comes and goes, you know, stars, like, as they move and all the energy they burn, they just convert it into something else. But it is really interesting that, you know, even if we were to use like a flyby anomaly, for example, as an example, like protons, or like matter versus antimatter, like what is known as like a true annihilation in the form of energy destroying each other, and it still turns into radiation at the end of the day. So it's like the same thing with nuclear fusions and fissions. You know, even if a star does lose a lot of mass, that mass eventually just ends up going somewhere else, or maybe the star ends up building up even more mass. So a lot of the stars like STEPHENSON2-18 and number 2, like, they have lost a lot of maybe photon fuel, or whatever you want to call it, like basically whatever energy that they've used to fuel their star systems and their core. But it's like also very interesting because the star itself still gets bigger even through a long period of time. You could also argue that as much as they've lost, maybe at some point in their star cycle, they've gained even more in some cases as well. So that's actually very interesting to really think about as well, how far that might traverse through their system and what that might mean for future astronomy, as well as physical genetics, rather, if we're trying to understand like the star cycles. And maybe it might even lead us on to like other stars that we thought never existed, or maybe they do exist but in another solar system, like, for example, another galaxy, rather, you know, like quasar stars, or not quasar stars, what is it, like I forget what they're called. They're at one point they were like called black hole stars. It was they start with a Q. It's like, it's not quasar, but it's something along those lines. I'll have to make a video about it. It's actually very interesting though. So the guy who originally discovered the star was known as Charles Stephenson, and he passed away back in like early 2000s, if I remember correctly. It was like 2010, 2000-ish. He passed away because he actually was born, he actually lived to be like 70-something years old. And he did live a long time for his time. You know, he actually was born right around 1930s, maybe 1920s. Yeah, so somewhere around there. So he was an astronomer. He was from Little Rock, Arkansas, I believe. He was an astronomer. He did a lot of other things too, but basically, the star originally was discovered in the 90s, but it took them a while to really observe it over time because, you know, paperwork does take time to go through. But he submitted it about roughly like before he passed away. So thankfully, you know, this was one of his discoveries, and he named it after himself. So in a way, that kind of explains why the star itself has been utilized. Like they say that because the star lost a lot of mass at one point, maybe that's why it's really a red supergiant instead of a red hypergiant, which is like the next phase between. So it's still a big star, but it's, you know, over time it would probably be one or the other, or it'll go up to the next elevation, depending on how big its mass is. And you really have to ask a scientist who can study such the luminosity. But what's even stranger is, like, you know, you're taking an object that's so far away and we can still get like some kind of an accurate measurement of it or something, you know, to go off of. Like, and I just think that's really amazing that there's people that can still figure this stuff out one way or another. The telescopes and technology that we've gotten over the years are just far more advanced, and just, man, just how they build them is just unbelievable, you know. So, but basically, here's something else to think about, though. You know, with a star as big as you know, STEPHENSON2-18, what they really did was the 18 actually had something to do with, like, they had like 18 other objects that were in it as well when it was originally discovered by Charles Bruce Stephenson before he passed away. It was actually part of a cluster, you know, more stars. It's part of a constellation too, if I remember correctly. I'm trying to remember. There's so many other constellations out there that could also be discovered that we don't even see. Colonies and stars and groupings. But basically, it's like, you know, it's like, you know, like Carl Sagan once said, where, you know, there's more stars in the, you know, the universe than there are, like, little sand pebbles on every beach known to mankind, or even more than that. So it makes you wonder, hey, the universe has got to be infinite. And even if the universe is a simulation of some kind, where's the real world at, you know? Kind of interesting when you think about it. There's always, basically the point I'm getting at is, there's always, either way you look at it, there's always going to be more questions you have than answers. And even then, there's always going to be more than you'll know, and there will always be opportunities everywhere. Hence, that's why I believe everything's infinite, because, you know, there's no end to it. There's always going to be something, even when we pass away, and something like that. So what else happens? I couldn't tell you. But more information I find, though, I'll make more videos about it, though. So that'll be interesting to think about, though. So if you like these kind of videos, please subscribe. Tell me what you think. If you have any requests, I'll dig it up, and I hope you enjoy.